So you want to improve your night photography? Night photography is one of the hardest skills to master. It brings a whole new set of challenges, but with the right amount of practice, time, and equipment, you too can master it. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. Night photography can be much more rewarding than daytime photography. Everything looks different at night and you don't have to go anywhere exotic to take amazing picture. You can take your time at night simply because there's less people usually around and you don't have to deal with light situation changing all the time. The main challenge photographing at night is getting the right exposure. During the daytime, you can walk around and hold your camera all day. At night, you have to worry about camera shake. In addition, due to the amount of light available during the day, you don't have to worry about shooting at high ISO and dealing with noisy images or grainy images. At night, however, hand holding is not an option. Digital noise will be a problem. The principles of exposure are the same at night or during the day. At night, however, you will need to give your camera more time to gather light. It goes without saying that at night, you will likely need to use a tripod and a flashlight or a speed light to be able to get decent exposure. But with these changes made, you can go ahead and explore the night with your camera. But here are some tips to help you maximize your experience during night photography. Tip number 1, set your aperture correctly. When you are taking photography at night, you have to ensure that you have the correct exposure triangle. The first of the 3 is your aperture setting. So the aperture setting is the amount of space you allocate to your lens or you provide to your lens. You want to make sure that your lens has the ability to gather as much light. And so what you want to do is set your f-stop to the lowest number, which translates to the widest aperture sight. And so whenever you are taking night photography, you want to pick the correct lens. Ideally, you want to find a lens with the lowest f-stop. Usually, most DSLR cameras come with a kit lens. A kit lens will have an f-stop of f4, which is not exactly great for night photography. So if you can find a lens that has a lower f-stop, usually you can get lenses that would have a 1.2 f-stop, which are usually the prime lenses, or a zoom lens. Those can go down to 2.8. That 1.2 to 2.8 can make a big difference when it comes to night photography. It's considered one stop of light and it could be the difference between underexposed or overblown images. And so make sure that whenever you are taking night pictures that your f-stop is to the lowest number possible. Now when you do set your f-stop to the lowest number possible, what happens is you end up getting a very narrow depth of field. During the day, having too shallow of depth of field can lead to blurry images, okay? But at night, it's not necessarily a concern simply because at night the background is usually black, so you don't have to worry about having too shallow of a depth of field. But at night, you definitely want to pick a lens that will give you the most amount of light gathering capabilities. The next item you want to think about is your ISO. ISO stands for image sensibility. It is basically your camera ability to make the sensor as sensitive as possible. It helps with trying to create quote-unquote artificial light. And so your camera can go ahead and make its sensor very sensitive to a little bit of light. But when you use the ISO to overcompensate for a lack of natural light, what happens is your images usually will have digital noise. And so your camera will introduce what we call grainy images. And so if you're looking at a black image or dark image, the shadows will tend to have a lot of static, so these little white dots will appear in your image, and they tend to again make your image less sharp. So again, just like aperture, you want to set your aperture to the lowest f-stop, and you want to set your ISO to the lowest possible ISO. Most cameras will have its base ISO at 100, which is great. Some cameras can go all the way to 52,000 ISO, but for a standard camera, you usually want to keep your ISO anywhere between 100 to 3200 to be able to get some decent ISO sensitivity, some lighting in there, but not to have too much grain once you start cranking up those numbers. The third item in your exposure triangle is the shutter speed. During the day, typically it is the shutter speed that you will set first. However, at night it is the last one, simply because your camera will usually be on a tripod, and so you can keep your shutter open as long as you want. However, at night, when you are adjusting your shutter speed, you have to take into account whether or not you're using an external flashlight. And so if you're using a flashlight, you have to make sure that your shutter speed usually falls between 100 to 200 of a second, simply because flashlight manufacturers set those flashes to go off at a specific time. And so you want your camera and your flashlight to be in sync. So I would recommend that you look at your the manual that comes with your flashlight and ensure that you set it properly in order to be able to achieve great exposure. Now that is part of the exposure triangle, and in order to keep the most amount of control on your exposure triangle, you absolutely have to set your camera to manual mode. Most digital cameras, you can set it on aperture priority, shutter priority, or ISO priority. For night photography, you want to have the most amount of control because it's going to result in the most amount of consistency from one picture to the other. So ensure you put it on manual mode on a Canon camera, which is what I typically use. It's going to be the letter M. Now that you have set your camera to manual mode and you got your exposure triangle correct, the next thing you want to do is ensure that your camera is taking RAW format images. RAW stands for read after write. They are the format that will give you the most amount of data to work with when you are in post. You can set your camera to either RAW or JPEG. A RAW file typically will have 35-bit of data that you can work with per image. A JPEG will have a third of that, so around 5 to 8-bit. Now, you want to set your camera to take RAW images because it will give you the most amount of dynamic range. And dynamic range is basically the scale of colors. And so at night, you want to make sure that you have the most amount of flexibility, and RAW images will give you that particular flexibility. Now that you have set up your exposure triangle correctly, the next setting that you need to adjust on your camera is your white balance. White balance is something that I had struggled at the beginning when I got started in photography, simply because I was never sure why my images looked different at night than they did during the day. During the day, I never really had any issues taking awesome pictures. My images always came out great. Now you move indoor at night under, tungsten light, and for some reason my images were coming out very orangey with a weird yellow filter, and so I couldn't make sense of it until I looked into it and realized that I have to set my white balance in order to be able to get the correct temperature in my final pictures. Now, having said all that, it's not a major issue if you set your white balance incorrectly when you're taking pictures, simply because software like Lightroom have a temperature scale that you can work with in order to get either very warm images or cool images. However, if you are taking a large number of pictures, if we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands sometimes, while having to adjust already all of the exposure plus the temperature, as you could see the trend there, you'll have a lot of work to do. So save yourself the time and energy and set your camera Kelvin temperature correctly for the scene that you're in, and you won't have to do all that work in post. Now that you have maximized all of the camera's features and functionality and settings, now you have to move to the hardware. Enter prime lenses. Prime lenses are basically single focus lenses. They're different than their zoom lens counterpart. Generally, a prime lens will not allow you to focus in and out like a zoom lens would do, but it is ideally what you want to use during night photography. The advantage of a prime lens is that they typically tend to have the lowest f-stop possible compared to a zoom lens. And a typical prime lens will have a 1.2 f-stop compared to a zoom lens that would have at the lowest 2.8. And that one stop of light can make the difference between underexposed and overexposed images. And what makes prime lenses awesome is their ability to be light, inexpensive, and very compact. And so the only drawback is that their inability to zoom, which is fine. And when you are using prime lenses, you can also have really nice images that will have a background separation. So I mentioned earlier bokeh and blurry background. Well, prime lenses are perfect for that. They make awesome portrait lenses, especially in busy scenes where there's a lot of people moving in the back. If you set your camera to the lowest f-stop, like at 1.2, you will have your basically subject really in focus and the background completely blurred out. And so in busy scenes like wedding ceremonies, when you just want to capture your subjects by themselves and you want to isolate them, prime lenses are awesome for that. Again, because of the low f-stop that they all have, typically they tend to have that wide aperture, and that allows you to keep your ISO very low and avoid those grainy images. Fujifilm recently released a lens called the 56mm 1.0. It happens to be the widest aperture lens ever, and from the images I saw online, wow, it creates these amazing background separation. It's a bokeh monster, and I'm seriously considering investing in that particular lens. So one of the best prime lenses that are available is the Canon 50mm 1.8. And what makes this particular lens very popular among photographers is its ability to keep the price reasonably affordable. We all know photography can be a very expensive hobby, but this particular lens allows really any beginner to acquire it, and it's even cheaper on the used market. So if you were to start with a prime lens, I would go ahead and start with the 50mm 1.8 that Canon produces. I believe Nikon has something similar, and so start with that and you won't be disappointed. You now have optimized your camera setting and you got a prime lens. You have set your camera on a tripod. The next thing you want to invest in is a speed light or flashlight. This is a shoe-mounted flashlight. It is made by Neewer. It's the TT560. It is an awesome flashlight. It allows me to take awesome pictures in dark environments when there is very little external lighting available. These devices can be simple or complicated depending on which model you buy, but you don't have to go and buy top of the market flashlight to achieve high quality images. As a matter of fact, this is a very economical flashlight. It has all the settings that I need. You can set the power range for it to have either a very bright flash or a medium flash. It can work in tandem with other flashlights, meaning that you can purchase more than one and set them on a tripod and have them work with each other, and you can create a lot of lighting in a room where there wouldn't be any natural lights. You could use it on top of the camera like I am right now, and just point it at your subject and able to achieve really nice night pictures. And you can keep ISOs low using these kinds of devices. Typically, you don't want to point the light directly at your subject because you risk overblowing the images. You will have a white subject. So what you would rather do when you are using an external flashlight like this is to point it directly up, which is what I do. And the Speedlight has a deflector. So what you would do is take a picture, point the flashlight directly up, and when you snap a picture, what happens is the deflector will evenly distribute the light, and so you can relatively create natural lighting this way. It is an inexpensive device. As a matter of fact, this particular flashlight, I was able to purchase it off Amazon. It was not very expensive, and you can buy more than one. It's very simple, highly recommended. You don't have to buy the Neewer TT560. As a matter of fact, Canon, Nikon, Fujifilm, Sony, they all make their own flashlights. You can spend a fortune on them, or you can spend reasonable amount of money and get a decent flashlight. In essence, they practically all do the same. What you want to do is buy a flashlight that has all of the basic functionalities, which is basically able to work on top of your camera and also react to other lenses, other flashes. So whenever you're using an off-camera flash, the sensor will trigger so that they will all go off at the same time to be able to create a natural lighting in that way. What you want to do is purchase a Speedlight that has the basic functionalities. You want to be able to work and focus more on your exposure rather than fiddling with all of the settings and features of that Speedlight. So again, the Neewer TT560 is a very inexpensive flashlight, highly recommended. Get one, it will improve your night photography tremendously. In summary, night photography is one of the hardest skills to master. However, with the proper training and practice, you too can master it. Remember, practice makes perfect. If you like this content, please hit the like and subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.